Logging your language learning can be very useful, and there are many tools and resources out there to help you. But which are the best, and how do you use them? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to continue discussing Chinese language logging, something that we started discussing in episode 41 and then kept discussing in episode 42. And back then I promised there would be a third episode focusing on tools and resources for language logging, and that is what we are going to talk about today. First though, I would like to say that next episode, which will mark 1 year of the Hacking Chinese podcast, I'm going to run a Q&A session. So if you have any questions for me or something that you would like me to address here on the podcast, please contact me on social media or send an email to editor@hackingchinese.com. But this episode is about language logging. And I'm not going to recap everything that I talked about in the first two parts, obviously, but just to put it briefly, in the first part we talked about why logging is important. And a few reasons that we looked at was that it makes learning visible, which can be very motivating, and make sure that you feel that you're actually learning something, even though you're not making noticeable progress in your, say, speaking or writing. Logging is also important for you to have an accurate idea of where you actually spend your time, because many people think that they are, say, listening a lot, but they actually spend most of their time doing vocabulary reviewing and so on. And if you need help from anybody, like if someone asks me about their study routine or something like that, the first thing I would like to know is, how are you spending your time? And is that aligned with your goals? And that kind of question is simply not possible to answer without proper logging. We cannot just rely on retroactively trying to think about what we're doing and add up hours. It seldom works that way. And once you know how much time you're spending right now, it also becomes easier to set reasonable goals to kind of increase that a little bit, but not so much that it becomes daunting. And of course, if you write down what you're learning, you can also share it with other people, either for encouragement, for accountability, or maybe if you need help with something. And finally, maybe one of the biggest benefits of logging your language learning is that you can make sure you have a balanced diet of Chinese, meaning that you are not spending 90% of your time in a flashcard app and you are listening as much as you should and so on. And this was in fact what we talked about in the second episode, which is episode 42 if you want to check it out in whole. So there we looked at two ways of dividing or categorizing language learning, and we looked at the 4 skills, so that would be listening, speaking, reading, and writing, plus vocabulary, which I added as a separate one, which is particularly important for Chinese because we do have Chinese characters to care about. We also looked at the 4 strands from Paul Nation, which is also a way of planning a curriculum or a personal study plan in our case. And those strands are meaning-focused input, meaning-focused output, language-focused learning, and fluency development. And I concluded that article by saying that one thing you could do is to combine the 4 skills with the 4 strands and thereby have a neat way of tagging and categorizing your learning activities. And in this article, we will see practical ways of actually doing this, but we will also look at simpler solutions that might be more to the point and where you will end up spending less time working with spreadsheets or complicated programs with lots of features you might not actually need. I have sorted the resources we are going to talk about into 6 categories. So the first one is analog tools, that would be notebooks, calendars, and whiteboards. The second one is time trackers, such as Toggle. The third one is productivity software, such as Notion. The fourth is spreadsheets, so good old Google Sheets or Excel. And the fifth one is social platforms, including social media, blogs, and so on. And the final one is habit builders, such as Habitica. So let's start by talking about something we're all aware of how they work, because they are very simple. And we're talking about a simple notebook, calendar, or whiteboard. And these have obvious advantages in that they are very concrete, they are easy to use, they have no advanced functions that you need to learn about, and so on. You just need a pen and you're good to go. Naturally, they also come with some drawbacks, such as if you lose your notebook, you're kind of screwed, and you can't lug your whiteboard around with you, so if you're not at home, it won't really work for tracking anything. Still, I use analog resources quite a lot when doing task management and language logging, simply because I think it's kind of satisfactory to put a real tick mark in a box I've written myself, rather than just tapping on a screen or clicking a mouse. But let's take this opportunity to go through some of the requirements we might have on resources and tools for language logging and see how these analog ones meet these. The first requirement is that we must be able to record how much time we spend. Well, this is not hard. You can do this. You just write down the numbers, right? And you can even add things up and have totals and so on. It's not that difficult to do, as long as you keep it fairly simple. The second requirement is that we must be able to tag or organize the time we spend, because otherwise we cannot do any kind of analysis. We cannot answer questions such as, am I spending too much time learning characters? Am I listening enough? And so on. And this is where analog resources really start failing, because we can sort things into one category. For example, we just log all our listening in one place or something like that. But it's a little bit tricky to tag things manually. You want to have maybe more than one way of splitting it, such as using both the skills we looked at in the previous episode and the 4 strands, which is kind of hard to do if you're just writing on paper. So here, I don't think that analog resources do very well. We also want to be able to add notes and comments and so on. Maybe we reach a milestone, we have a question, or we just want to write down what we did. And that's, of course, super easy in a notebook. You just write it down. You're not restricted by a software. You can write whatever you want. And you can keep a separate notebook if you want, where you have questions and problems and so on. So this is an area where analog resources excel and work very well. Number 4 is to visualize the time we spend, and maybe also in relation to some goals that we might have. Here again, analog resources are not that good. I mean, yes, we can maybe, we can have a calendar and you color it depending on what you did and how much you did, and then you can get some kind of overview how you did and so on. But you're kind of stuck with one way of doing it, and once you've kind of gone down one path, you cannot easily change. Whereas if you do this in, say, a spreadsheet, or you have an app that does this, you can change various ways of showing it and visualizing the data. So analog resources can do this, but it's not as pretty, and it is also less flexible. And so finally, number 5, we want to be able to share our log with others. And this is, of course, not very easy. If you have a whiteboard, maybe it can be a little bit social, because other people in your household will see your whiteboard, so they can maybe check in on you, or you can ask them and point to it. Of course, you can take a photograph of your whiteboard, and you can scan your notebook and so on, but that's getting into the digital territory, which we are going to talk about next. So let's talk a little bit about time trackers, and these are apps and programs that are meant to do just that, track time. Many of these are designed for teams or sometimes for freelancers to keep track of how much time they spend on various projects for billing purposes, or maybe for planning purposes or follow-up reports and so on. And this is actually quite good for us language learners, because we use them for ourselves, and many of these services are actually completely free for individuals, and they then earn money from teams once individuals like them enough and they propose them to the whole team. For us, though, sticking with an individual plan is fine, and that is usually completely free, so that's kind of nice. And I've used some of these, but the one that I've stuck to the longest is Toggl. It's spelled Toggl, very hip and trendy. And it's basically just a simple timer where you turn it on and off. You write down what kind of activity it is. You can tag it. You can put it into certain projects, and you can then generate various types of reports depending on this. So, for example, if you go to the article on Hacking Chinese that goes with this podcast episode, you can see what language learning or language logging might look like in Toggl. And here I've used projects to denote the 4 strands. And then I've used tags to denote the 4 skills. And then you can generate nice reports and see how much time you spent in various areas and so on. So this is all very simple. Toggl takes, 5 minutes to get used to, and it's extremely easy. There are some advanced features, of course. You can export data, import data, and so on. But if you're just after the basic time tracking features, that's very easy to get used to. Naturally, there are alternatives to Toggl, such as Clockify, T-Metric, My Hours, Tracking Time, and so on. But I have not used these specifically for language learning, and I don't want to recommend them. I just want to throw it out there that there are numerous alternatives. And this goes for all of the kinds of resources I talk about in this episode. I cannot possibly try out all the different tools available. So if you have tried something that you think works pretty well, or maybe something that works really badly, it would be awesome if you went to Hacking Chinese, checked out the article, and left a comment. Because together we can then maybe map the territory of various time logging tools available. So what if you think that these time trackers are too basic? You want to be able to do more than just tally up the amount of hours you spend in various areas. Well, then we get to the next category, which is productivity software. This is a vaguely defined category of apps and programs that are meant to increase productivity, maybe for individuals, but often for teams. So it's for project management and so on. Now, naturally, we're only interested in their potential for language learning, but I still want to mention Notion, and that's notion.so if you want to check it out, which I use for keeping track of everything I do with Hacking Chinese and my university job, and also for my Skritter job. I think that Notion is in a sweet spot in between fairly simple note-taking apps such as Evernote and more advanced project management software that have lots of features that I don't really need. But Notion is nice because I can collect all the data I want, all the notes I want, and it also has features to deal with basic task management and progress tracking. I haven't really started learning a new language recently, and I haven't therefore had the opportunity to use Notion for serious language learning, even though I use it for everything else. So I would like to recommend two videos on YouTube. One of them is Notion for Language Learning, a Game Changer by Chris from Actual Fluency. Also make sure to check out the Actual Fluency podcast, especially episode 181, where I appear. The other video is from Lindy Botis and is called How I Plan and Organize My Life and Languages in Notion. And like I said, Notion is probably overkill if you just want to keep track of what you're doing, but if you're looking for a more powerful tool to organize things in general, including your language learning, it can be very useful. The next category of tools and resources we are going to talk about is the good old spreadsheet. So this would be Excel or Google Docs or something like that. And this is the resource that I use by far the most when it comes to tracking anything. I use it much more than anything else. And even though I just said I used Notion a lot for certain task management and so on, I still use spreadsheets much more when it comes to tracking things like progress. So logging itself, I usually do in Google Sheets. If you head over to the Hacking Chinese article linked to in the description of this episode, you will be able to see a spreadsheet that I built just to show how you can do language logging fairly easily in Google Sheets. And this is something that took me maybe 20-30 minutes to do. Of course, it takes time to write down all the language activities, but the advantage with the spreadsheet program is that once you know how to use it, you can whip up basically anything and it doesn't take that long. And if it's something like language logging that you're going to do for a long time, spending a little bit extra time is, of course, good. And you can use my spreadsheet, you can expand on it, or you can do whatever you want with it. But the nice thing with spreadsheets is, of course, that you have all the data in a very neat, organized way, so you can do whatever you want with it. Do you want maybe graphs showing certain things? You can do that. Do you want to import them into other programs to do something? Yeah, you can do that as well. And of course, spreadsheets only do exactly what you tell them. And that is very nice if you already know how to use these programs, which I think is extremely useful in general. But if you don't, that's obviously also a downside, because if you don't know how to use, say, Google Docs, creating a sheet like this might take you a very long time. And fortunately, you can use other people's sheets. You don't have to do it all on your own, or you can do something much simpler, simply writing down the dates, how much time you spent, what skill it belongs to, and maybe some notes is very simple. You don't need advanced spreadsheet skills to do that. If you don't like spreadsheets, then maybe you are more a social person. Maybe you like to be accountable by sharing with everybody what you're doing and committing to things publicly, or just feeling that you're part of a larger community of learners. And this is very easy to do. Many people do this on Instagram, where they share their learning, or they tweet about what they've studied today, and so on and so forth. And this can be very powerful. I've used this a few times, although I don't normally do it. For example, over at Hacking Chinese Challenges, I run monthly challenges with a certain topic in mind, and the idea then is that you improve by daily practice and friendly competition. That particular challenge was sponsored by Skritter, and I also set a goal to clear my queue in Skritter, which had grown to more than 1,000 characters, which is fairly daunting. And by committing to this in public, on social media, and reporting my progress every day, I was able to clear the queue at the end of the challenge. So that was pretty nice. And we actually made 2 videos about the challenge. So if you go to the Skritter YouTube channel and simply search for vocabulary challenge, you'll be able to find both of those. So like I said, this is not something I use all the time, but for some people it is very useful, and then it's definitely something that you should check out. The final category of tools and resources for language logging that we are going to look at today is habit builders. And this is what I call apps that are meant to form habits. They are not necessarily there to track how much you do of certain kinds of activities, but rather to establish habits. And of course, the go-to person for learning more about habit formation is James Clear, and if you haven't read Atomic Habits yet, you should do so. I also have an article called Habit Hacking for Language Learners, which goes through the basics. Anyway, so these tools are meant to help you do this, and I have used two that I think are worth sharing here. So one of them is called Habitica. It was used to be called Habit RPG, which is actually a better name in a sense, because if you like role-playing games, and I mean computer-based or video games here, this is actually a gamified way of establishing and maintaining habits. You set up goals, you get rewards, you level up your character and so on. But of course, in difference with all the video games we play, leveling up here is actually for real. You level up yourself in real life, and you can use some of these encouraging and motivating mechanisms from games to level up your language learning as well. Naturally, if you're not already into RPGs, this is not something you should even check out. It probably doesn't make much sense. The other resource I want to recommend here, Habitify, is much more straightforward and probably suits a larger number of people. It's a much simpler app that is just meant to help you set up some habits you want to achieve and then track your progress towards those and hold you accountable. So check that out if that sounds interesting. And if you need more guidance about this, I would also like to remind you that I do have a course called Unlocking Chinese, the Ultimate Guide for Beginners. And it does include things such as tones, characters, and some basic words, and how to learn all these things, how to structure your learning, and so on and so forth. But in this series of podcast episodes, we've talked a lot about language logging, but we haven't really talked that much about how do you think about this? What is an appropriate balance between the skills, and how do you determine that? And that is something that we do go through in the course, among other things. Anyway, so if you've made it this far into this episode and maybe listened to the previous episodes too, I would be interested in hearing about your language logging experience. Because like I said, I have not tried even a fraction of all the resources and tools out there. So it would be very nice if you have tried something and you liked it a lot and want to recommend it. Please follow the link in the description of this podcast episode and leave a comment on Hacking Chinese and let all of us know which resources you have found helpful for logging your Chinese learning. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.